Welcome back. Let's kick off this explainer by using our imaginations for just a second. Picture a split landscape in your mind. On one side of the street, you've got these bustling, fiercely competitive private shops, tech startups, and independent cafes, all trying to maximize their profits. But right next to them, literally running right down the center of the street, is a massive, heavily subsidized public railway system, built and maintained by the state for everyone's benefit. It's a pretty fascinating contrast, right? Well, that split landscape is actually the perfect visual for our topic today, the mixed economy. It's the hybrid engine powering so much of our modern society, dictating everything from the price of your morning coffee to the actual roads you drive on. Today, we're going to pop the hood, tear down the engine block, and see exactly how this thing runs.
To really get a grip on this, let's look at how the system is actually defined. At its core, a mixed economy is a system that combines the private and public sectors with one massive, overriding goal: achieving maximum social welfare. Basically, it's a pragmatic compromise. It attempts to take the absolute best elements of capitalism, innovation, efficiency, that relentless drive for profit, and weave them together with the protective, welfare-oriented elements of socialism. And what's really interesting here is that this isn't some ancient economic philosophy. It's actually a relatively recent concept. It was originally propounded by the legendary economist J.M. Keynes during the Great Depression of the 1930s. During that global crisis, it became painfully clear that completely unregulated markets could lead to total disaster, which prompted the need for this whole new hybrid approach.
So here is exactly how we'll unpack this hybrid engine today. First, we'll look at the mixed economy's meaning, then how public and private work together. After that, we'll hit prices, plans, and controls, followed it up with the government's balancing act, and finally look at reducing wealth inequality.
All right, let's jump right into the first part and understand the basic meaning and where this system actually sits on the economic spectrum. When we look at the global stage, we can clearly see three main types of economies, totally based on who owns the means of production. On one far end, you have the capitalist economy, where production is controlled entirely by the private sector. The classic example here, of course, is the USA. Way over on the exact opposite end is the socialist economy, where the government or the public sector controls the means of production. Think historical examples like the USSR or North Korea today. But right smack in the middle, that's the mixed economy. Here, the means of production are shared. They're controlled by both the public and private sectors. India is a fantastic example of this. They opted for this exact model and heavily institutionalized it with their second five-year plan back in 1956, perfectly bridging that massive gap between pure capitalist and pure socialist systems.
Which brings us seamlessly to our next focus: how the public and private sectors actually coexist and work together.
There's a really strategic division of labor at play here. It's not just some random free-for-all. There's a very distinct logic to who does what. The public sector steps up to take charge of industries of immense national importance. Things that require massive capital are absolutely essential for public welfare, but maybe aren't highly profitable. We're talking defense industries, power generation, and vast infrastructure networks like the railways or the postal service. On the flip side, the private sector is unleashed in areas where consumer choice and competition really drive efficiency. They get to focus on consumer goods, agriculture, and small-scale industries. Driven purely by the profit motive, you get massive private conglomerates like Tisco and Reliance in India representing this side. The whole objective is to make sure the invisible hand of the market perfectly meets the guiding hand of the state. It's about getting the absolute best of both worlds.
And the real crux of this relationship is fascinating. On one hand, you have production largely owned and handled by private sectors, simply because private enterprise is usually just better at the actual day-to-day manufacturing and service delivery. But, and this is a massive but, regulations are made by the government. It's essentially a closed feedback loop. The state doesn't want to micromanage the factory floor, right? But it does draw the boundaries. It regulates and controls private enterprise through licensing, import controls, and direct policies. Why? Just to ensure those private businesses don't act purely out of self-interest, but actually end up serving the wider economic health of the whole nation.
So how does all that regulation actually work in practice? Let's get into the dual-engine system of prices, plans, and controls.
What we see here is a truly fascinating dual system at work. A mixed economy doesn't just pick one lane. It relies on both the free market price mechanism and central economic planning at the exact same time. For the private sector, the system relies on prices to signal supply and demand. Pretty standard. But the government doesn't just leave it entirely to chance. They use monetary and fiscal policies, think adjusting interest rates or changing taxes, to gently nudge the private sector in the right direction. The source material actually calls this planning by inducement. You aren't explicitly forcing a company to build a solar plant, but hey, you might offer a massive tax break to induce them to do it anyway. Conversely, for the public sector, the government uses direct economic planning. They sit down, write out comprehensive 5-year plans, and directly dictate the goals and investments for their public enterprises.
But you might be wondering, what happened when the private market gets out of hand? Like when unexpected shortages happen and open market prices for essential everyday consumer goods start to completely skyrocket. Well, in a pure capitalist system, the market just prices people out. Tough luck. But in a mixed economy, the government has an emergency brake. The state steps in with strict guardrails, imposing things like price ceilings, literally capping the maximum legal price a commodity can be sold for. And if supply gets dangerously low, they'll even establish ration shops to distribute goods directly to the consumers who desperately need them. By doing this, the government is actively imposing controls on both the demand and the supply side of the market to protect its citizens from extreme shocks.
Now, let's zoom out a bit and look at the philosophy behind this whole approach, the government's grand balancing act.
As you've probably gathered by now, the government in a mixed economy is highly active. The Indian government, which is our prime example here, proves that a strict laissez-faire approach, meaning a totally hands-off policy where the state just leaves the market alone, is definitely not followed. Instead, the government takes on this multifaceted, positive role. First off, they act as a regulator, keeping monopolies in check and enforcing the rules of the game. Second, they're a promoter, actively encouraging private investment in specific strategic sectors. Third, they act as a planner, drafting the long-term macroeconomic roadmap for the entire nation. And finally, they're a provider of massive public goods that the private market would never find profitable enough to build on its own. Think rural roads or basic sanitation networks. They balance all these roles simultaneously to protect the larger social welfare of the economy.
And that brings us to the ultimate moral and economic goal of this entire system, reducing wealth inequality. You know, one of the biggest, most consistent criticisms of pure capitalism is that it inevitably leads to massive inequalities of income and wealth. The whole "the rich get richer while the poor get poorer" dynamic. Well, the mixed economy explicitly tries to solve this. To ensure the system truly maximizes social welfare for everyone, the state actively uses policy tools to flatten that wealth gap. Two major mechanisms highlighted in our source material are progressive taxation, where higher income earners are taxed at a proportionately higher percentage, and the levy of death duties, which are essentially inheritance taxes. By pulling these specific policy levers, the government is trying to redistribute wealth and actively curb the natural disparities that always pop up in the private market, aiming for a much more equitable distribution of the nation's overall resources.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the massive, incredibly complex task a mixed economy tries to pull off and ask ourselves a critical question. Can a perfect balance between private wealth generation and public welfare ever truly be achieved? It's a system of constant push and pull, endlessly adjusting the dials of regulation and economic freedom. How might sudden shifts in political power or unforeseen global crises tip the scales of this incredibly delicate hybrid system? Will the private sector demand fewer regulations to stay competitive, or will the public demand more protections for everyday citizens like you and me? That is a fundamental thought to keep chewing on as you continue exploring the fascinating world of macroeconomics. Thanks for diving into the mechanics of the mixed economy with me today.